Welcome to the MuseCast, where we squeeze every last drop of inspiration out of Sunday's sermon.
Dan.
We're so professional. Oh, I forgot that. Yes.
Oh my gosh. There we go. Now I can officially say Happy Muse Day. I can't do it if I don't get the finger guns. So we should call them something else. We need to call them something.
Huckleberries.
The Huckleberries.
That's right.
Good job. I like it. Little inside joke there. I like it. Okay. Happy Muse Day. Dan has brought a friend, brown sugar.
Yep.
Why? Because it's beautiful autumn, fall, cooler temps, a little frost on the rooftops today. So brown sugar had to make an appearance.
That's right. Yeah, it is. There's a nip in the air, and I should tell you, we have a neighborhood cat that just meanders around, and so we had a neighbor 2 houses over, and they had this indoor-outdoor cat, and so they would let the cat out, and he would wander around for a couple days, then go back, and then they would let it out again. And well, they moved like 3 miles away, and the cat has traveled all the way back here because he likes this neighborhood. So he hangs out on our deck. Yeah, he hangs out on our deck, and so we have a little couch out there for him, and with a little heating pad.
Oh
and
my gosh!
yeah,
I love it so much.
Yeah, a little brown sugar for him, you know.
Oh, cute. Is his name Max? This cat?
No, Rambo.
Okay, I'm asking because on the TikTok, there is this viral cat that the it's an indoor outdoor cat, and the family has put a GoPro on him, and this cat terrorizes the neighborhood. So my FYP is like full of videos of people like concerned about the other neighborhood cats because this cat Max is a terror. And the family just puts a GoPro on him and they let him loose, and they're like, you guys are worried about gas prices, inflation. I'm worried about Max and what he's doing in the neighborhood. So glad to hear that Max and Rambo are not one and the same.
No, Rambo's more of a, let's just hang out and think deep thoughts kind of cat. My kind of cat, basically.
So, that's why he's chilling on the Kent deck.
That's right.
He's contemplative. Okay.
That's right. Yep.
Well, Dan Kent, MuseCast high five to you.
Hey, hold on. I got to go to the high five cam.
Oh, high five cam.
Yeah, there it is. Okay, we're good.
Ready?
We're good. All right.
MuseCast high five to Dan Kent for delivering a really good sermon. The joy of God's judgment. The joy. And that, gosh, in knowing about the sub-series and knowing in broad strokes what you were going to preach on, that was a doozy. Also knowing that, again, you only have so much time to say what needs to be said. And so, wowza, that was a doozy. And you just did it really well, really, really well. And before you get into your summary, I just want to say I loved the Dan Kent Cliff Notes of setting up the history of where we'd been in the series, well, in the entirety of the unveiling. I just thought that was really helpful. So MuseCast high five to Dan. Right. And I'm excited to hear your summary. And we got in some really good questions that we're going to talk about today, and maybe hear not all, but some of the things that you had to leave out. So yeah.
All right.
Proud of you.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Yeah, this sermon was really touch and go. Like, I was supposed to call Greg on Wednesday and kind of share what I'm thinking about doing and get his feedback on it. And I was like the Tasmanian devil on Wednesday. I mean, there was like papers blowing all over the place, and I had no idea what I was doing. And because there's just so much, and I know that we have a lot more that we're going to be talking about down the road. And so you kind of have to say, well, you can't go too far that way. And so Greg next week is going to start talking about what justice is. And what I kept finding as I was preparing for this message is I would follow this idea. And I okay, well, yeah, and the text kind of implies this. And then, an hour into thinking about this kind of text, I would realize that now I'm talking about what justice is. And that's for next week, And so it was a little tricky. And so what I did was I said, okay, I'm just going to focus on the promise of justice and why that by itself is just a great thing. And so how I did the sermon was I wanted to, one of the advantages of being at Woodland Hills is we get some really, you know, pretty I mean, Greg is a very special thinker, and Paul Eddy is a very special thinker, and we're very blessed to have both of them here. And Greg is just, I mean, 2 weeks he was like really going at some of these really big, important, foundational ideas. In the last two sermons before mine, it just felt like these are sermons that people should go back to as they, as they pursue God, because that's just how foundational they were. But they were very abstract, and they sort of floated away from the text. And so I wanted to just get back to the text, because I don't want to lose sight of how special the book of Revelation is, because it really is just so wild. It's like it's so genius. And you think of like some of the bestsellers now, the Da Vinci Codes and the 50 Shades of Grey, and just like these really shallow, silly sort of stories. And like, what has 2000 years of progress gotten us? Nothing compared to like some of this type of writing is just so brilliant and so profound. And people are so gaga about like, the future and technology, and look at how far we've come. And in some ways we have, but I tell you, in other ways we haven't. And so I really wanted to go back to the text and just show like, okay, this is where we're at, because I want to stay close to what John is saying. And so I started the sermon by doing kind of a summary. And I'm not going to summarize the summary, because if you do that, you can implode in on yourself and become a black hole. So I don't want to do that. But what I did is I said, okay, this is chapters 1 through 5, and then that brought me to chapter 6. And chapter 6 is interesting, because this is after we're told that the Lamb has conquered. He's worthy to open the scroll. And now we're thinking, okay, God is making progress now. And we're also told that he has conquered. He has won. Satan is defeated. And now, man, we are right there. It's time to celebrate. But no, it's not, because you've got the 4 horsemen. And it's like, not only is it not time to celebrate, but it feels like things are getting worse. And then you come to my verse, which is verses 9 and 10, where John sees these souls under the altar right there in the throne room of God, and they are crying out for the Lord to avenge their death. And they died because they did not betray God. They remained faithful to God, and they were martyred because of it. And so I just think that's interesting, like some of the questions that arise there, and some of the questions that we have in life as we look at suffering and evil and all of that, is like, what is the point of remaining faithful to God? And in what way has God won? Because it doesn't look like God has won. And so how do you what do you do with that? And so what I focus on, and we're going to be looking at this over the next few weeks, but to start with, I just think it helps that we're told that even the heroes of the book of Revelation, the martyrs, the people who were faithful, those who are, exalted as this is who we should aspire to be like, even they are sharing in those same laments. And that makes me feel good that it's not just me. The Bible's not running from this problem. It's totally embracing this problem. And then the second thing that is really helpful there is the fact that they are crying out right there in the throne room, right at the altar in the throne room, which means that the Lord is hearing our laments, our cries, our suffering is that important to God. And it is just it kind of encapsulates, or not encapsulates, it kind of swirls around the Lord at all times. I'm right there close to his heart in the throne room. And that also makes me feel good. But then John, and we haven't really gotten there fully yet, but John then, right after this has this promise that God will have a day of judgment. In other words, all of these wrongs will be righted. And I just kind of did this montage of all of these different injustices in the world, and just kind of question, like, okay, what we know about God because we doubt when we see these injustices, we doubt God and we doubt that these things will ever be righted. And so I just kind of gave this montage to challenge us to say, okay, hold on to what we know about God. We know God is good. We know God is loving. We know God is a covenant God. We know God is faithful. We know God has these promises and he does not let down his people. He follows through on his promises. And so I just applied those to each of those injustices. And then I just talked about what is the power of this promise of justice. And to me, the big kind of payoff or the power of this promise is it means that ultimate reality is just. And even though it doesn't seem like it, because it seems like ultimate reality is unjust for many different reasons. But the Bible, the Revelation, is unveiling this claim that no, it is in fact just, even though it doesn't look like it. And that is, boy, if you can trust that, if you believe that, if you are convinced by that, that should change how we live, and because the assumption that the boy, I'm mumbling on my words here. The assumption that ultimate reality is unjust has very different implications in our lives than the assumption that reality is just. And so I just kind of went through those. If you think that ultimate reality is unjust, well, that means that the universe is amoral. It doesn't care one way or the other about what happens. And that means that perpetrators of evil, a lot of times they just get away with it. And there's no consequences for sinning. And if that's the case, if the universe doesn't care about it, and if there are no consequences, if they're not caught, and if people don't actually step in and do something, well, then that means all of the pressure and weight of justice lands on our individual shoulders, which is tough for us. And we have to be judges and we have to be the police. But if you can believe that ultimate reality is just, well, that means that the universe does care. It matters what we do, and nobody gets away with sin. We all have an accounting. We don't have to be we don't have to have the whole weight of justice on our shoulders. Obviously, the more justice we can get here in life, the better. But it's not all on our shoulders, and that also means that not only do we not have to be judges, but it's actually better if we're not judges. It's better if we leave all judgment to God, as Paul said. And I just think that that's a much more joyful, freeing way to live. And that's where the joy of God's judgment comes in, because it's in his judgment that we have this final justice. And that final justice allows me to have a much more joyful life. And so that's the title of the sermon. And I only had time to talk about two of the ways that assumption that the universe is just helps me live more joyfully. The first reason is because it allows me to live with a more open heart and mind toward the world and toward the future. Because, when you believe that ultimate reality is unjust, and when you believe that if there's going to be any justice, I have to bring it, man, that's really tough, because there's a lot of the evil that we see in the world, a lot of suffering that we see, and the injustices that we see, where there's not any recompense for it. There's nothing that we can actually do to make it just. And the example I use is if someone kills a loved one, like my child, for instance, man, there's nothing I can do to that person that's going to make this situation just. That's not going to bring my kid back. I don't really care what happens to this person. I just want my kid back, And so we're in this trap where we can't really bring justice in some of these situations, and that's really, really tough. But when I believe that ultimate reality is just, and God is involved, well, guess what? God can do a lot of things that I can't. He might not be able to do it right now, but he promises that whatever I have bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and that includes my love for my kids, and which means that there will be a reuniting, and those wounds will not only be healed. Paul says that the wounds that I'm feeling are not even worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed when God brings his judgment. And so that means I can live more open, and I don't have to get so obsessed about a particular injustice. And obviously, if someone were to do something to one of my kids, I would absolutely pursue it, and I would give my all to pursuing justice. But my hope, my faith, my joy is not dependent on it. Of course, I have to grieve. Of course, there's going to be sadness, wailing, there's going to be suffering, but that doesn't have to be the end of my story. That doesn't have to be the end of anything. It can just be a chapter, it can be a sentence, it can be a speed bump, and then I can move on to other things that God has for me. And I just talked about this great Chinese parable about a farmer and how he keeps having these good and bad things happening to him. And the neighborhood keeps thinking, oh, that's terrible. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's terrible. But what happens is the bad things end up leading to a good thing, and the good thing ends up leading to a bad thing. And you never really know if something is actually good or bad while we're here. And that makes sense in the Christian story because we live in a realm that is under spiritual attack. We live in the middle of a spiritual war zone. You've got the super duper, I called him, the Satan figure who is trying to steal, kill, and destroy all of our joy and all of our goodness. And then you've got this source of all truth. We've got God who loves us, who is bringing good out of those evils. And if good is brought out of those evils, then you have this Satan figure trying to steal, kill, and destroy that good. And so it's just, you never really know, but you can just be open to that, knowing that even though there's all sorts of ups and downs here, in the end, God has promised that what will be revealed in us is way bigger than any bad thing that might have happened on the path to get there. And then the second kind of joy that I looked at when you believe that ultimate reality is just, is that it allows us to take the counsel of Jesus when he tells us to take heart. He says, in this world you will have troubles, but take heart. I have overcome the world. And a couple of things about that. One is he sets this expectation that don't expect the world to not be troublesome. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be hard. And he says this right before, this is the last teaching he gives before he's arrested and put on the cross. And so he knows that's coming, and yet he still says to take heart. And he says, I have overcome the world, which is another way of saying that everything that's talked about in chapter 5 of Revelation about the Lamb being worthy and the Lamb conquering, Jesus is saying that's true. I have conquered. And so even though what we see with the war and the famine and the suffering and the death, those are just little skirmishes that Satan is desperately trying to win as his time is running out. And so when we can trust that it's over, when we can trust that Jesus has in fact overcome the world, then we can take heart. We can live with that courage. We can live with that hope in the future, and we can face anything here on earth because we know that it will not nothing that we can experience here can sabotage the justice that's coming, the joy that I'm entitled to, and the joy that Christ used as his own motivation as he took on the cross for the joy that was set before him. That's the same joy that we can tap into because we are being shaped into a kingdom of priests to dwell with God for all eternity. And that is going to be amazing. And anything that happens here, it's just horrible speed bumps towards something that is going to be like nothing we experience here. So that is sort of my summary. But yeah, so it's always weird summarizing my own sermon, but there it is.
It is. It's like you get to give it 3 times in the run through, and then for the service, and then for the MuseCast when you have to summarize it.
That's
so
right.
thank you for all of that. Yeah, I feel like there are so many layers to what you shared with us. And one of the layers that I've kind of camped out on, because we've talked in our church before about Lectio Divina, just kind of like sitting with certain things. and I'm not sure this is where you wanted me to sit, but I'm just going to say it. Like the one of the places I have camped out on is kind of in the beginning when you talked about the souls of the martyrs and they're crying out, "How long, O Lord?" And I just thought about, well, two things. One, I thought that's a great example, guys. Like, this is what we're supposed to strive for. And then this is what we see happening with them still. Like, oh, I don't know about that. But really where I've kind of camped out a bit is the importance of the lament. I feel like I don't know if it's a current cultural phenomenon or if it's just, the plight of our human race for all eternity, but I feel like we just are so hungry and quick for like to turn the page, like to get to the end, to get to the happy ending, to see the good. And we really shy away from sitting in the lament, sitting in the pain, sitting in the crying out. And I say that as someone who would love to avoid all
Yeah.
pain and suffering, of course. But I do feel like there's something there. I feel like God meets us there in profound ways that I think many times we really quickly want to scooch past that. So I am certain that's not where you wanted me to camp out, Dan Kent, but that is
Yeah.
something that stood out to me.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that because I do think that there is a tendency, and that's definitely my tendency. I'm a minimizer, so I tend to want to just move on to the next thing. But what's really interesting is I got an email from a parishioner in South America
Yeah.
who was really thankful for the sermon because she had experienced these injustices that
Mm.
were really, really hard on her. And she felt like she could not let go of those things because if she were to let go of them, then it would mean that they weren't that big of a deal. It would minimize the importance of it. And so the sermon was helpful for her because it felt like it gave her permission
Yeah.
to let go and maybe be open to joy again. And so
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think some people do tend to move on quick. Other people tend to not let go and
Yeah.
not move on. And so I think you have to look at both risks there. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
Getting stuck in the pain, that's not good.
yeah,
That's not
yeah,
healthy. Yeah, and so I would say the next place in which I've kind of camped out is just when you were talking about, the ultimate reality. Like, do we believe that it is just or do we believe that it is unjust? And that is a question I don't think is a one-time ask. I find myself, now that I've framed it this way, constantly asking that question. Like, what is my belief in the ultimate reality? Do I believe that it is a God who is good and just and loving, and judgment, his judgment will come, his justice will come? Or do I feel the pressure to take it on myself to make sure that the business gets handled? And so I think that's a tough question for people, and I'm really glad that you laid that out for us. I think you painted a really good picture about that, about what happens, what we're actually saying in reality when we feel like the reality is that the ultimate reality is unjust. Like, the pressure and the responsibility that fits on us as humans, that's great. And I don't mean in a good way, great. That's grand. That's huge. That's
yeah,
big. And I don't think we're equipped for that whatsoever.
yeah,
And so in many ways, it is, the way I'm seeing it, it is God's loving stance toward us to say, let me handle that.
mhm,
I don't want you to worry about handling that. Trust that I will handle that. And so I do think many times people get caught in the belief that in someday that God will make all things right. But in our present moment, we want accountability. We want consequences. We want to see that however we've been wronged is being made right. And it's really hard many times to let go of that power and control over that. And so again, I think your reminder that this is not the end of the story, that there is more. Like, we just really only see just a teeny tiny bit of the grand story. And so I know that what we're experiencing, or what people we love or care for experience, can seem monumental, and many times it is. As big as things are, as huge as the trauma or the pain or whatever it is can be, it's still not the end of the story. There is something much grander at work. And this is why I remind myself, like, this is why it's faith. Like our faith, we're having to rely on things that we can't physically know and grasp onto in every moment. It is just, it's a faith of trusting the character of God toward us and toward humanity and toward this world and the animal kingdom and all of that, trusting that he has a plan that is not what we're currently living in. But we're trying to move our weights toward that. So, that's a lot of my jumbling thoughts, but I blame you, sir. That was you and your sermon.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point too. The fact that, of course God wants to, help with that. Of course God, that's what love is to assist in that. And it'll be interesting to see where Greg goes with some of this judgment and justice talk, because I think he will talk about how there's so many reasons. I mean, there's good reasons to pursue justice, of course. I mean, that's what love looks like in the world. And so that's where, the trouble is always like, how do you talk about justice without making one of those two kind of errors? On one hand, minimizing the injustices and not caring about justice per se at all, versus kind of the being so kind of entrenched in injustices that you are no longer open to joy and the good things that are in the world, and you're no longer a light in the world. You've been swallowed up by the darkness, and so those are the two errors that you can make, where you're either going to I mean, ultimately what you want to do is you want to be a light to the world.
Yeah.
You want your love to lead to justice, but like, you could get swallowed up by the injustice, or you can just avoid the darkness altogether, and those are both mistakes. So
Yeah,
it's
amen
probably
to
all
that.
very redundant.
No, it's good. And we're going to get to these questions, but I just wanted to say, you just said something that reminded me. One of the things that I, highlighted and starred was the love looks like justice in the face of injustice. And so you said that, and you talked about how God, he hears our cries. And so we need to open our heart and our mind to see God at work there. And so I just thought that was a really beautiful encouragement. We did get some questions from folks that I think are really good. Do you want to go to those now, Dan?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
And I will say too, again, I think it's important for people to remember we're in a series. These aren't just one-offs. And so there are things that Dan like he said, as he was studying and going down different trails and rabbit holes, like he had to pull back, because he's like, oh no, that's getting into what's coming. And so just know that many times what you're wondering is maybe still to come. So
That's right.
hopefully that is helpful to folks. Okay. So we had some more practical questions, Dan, regarding the justice of it all. And then we had more of a big picture question pertaining to the passage in Revelation 6 that you shared. So I want to let you choose which direction we go first.
Let's start big picture.
Okay. So big picture is that someone was confused about the verses in Revelation that you shared. This person said that they feel like what we're seeing there is a crying out for vengeance and not justice. So that's one. And then secondly, this person says, if they are in God's throne room, why aren't they praying the prayer of Jesus, as Jesus did when he was on the cross? Father, forgive them, for they did not know what they are doing. A desire for vengeance seems to be a rather carnal desire. How is that carnal, fleshly desire able to live in the throne room, in God's presence? How can that survive? So vengeance, not justice. And then how, if they are crying out for vengeance, how is that able to be in God's presence?
Yeah. So the translation that I used, they are literally crying out to God to avenge their blood. And so it's a good question. And the relating it to what Jesus said on the cross is really interesting because it's a really good observation. Well, I just think it's a good observation because I didn't make that connection, and Paul Eddy did. And so anytime you connect with something that Paul Eddy connects with, that's a good observation.
Doing
Um,
good.
yes, yeah. And so what he said is, he thinks that what is being revealed here is that, that's a that's a place where even the martyrs still have growth to do. They're not where Jesus is yet. In the same way that, Peter cutting off the soldier's ear, and just like you could be right there and still not be there. And so that's sort of how Paul reconciles that. And I think that's definitely a possible way of looking at that. Also, though, I think the um, the word that is translated as avenge, it doesn't have a great translation to English. It can mean avenge like that, but it can also mean just to make right or to redeem. So it wouldn't be like, it would be like if, if you if you're watching a football game and the quarterback is just, he's missing, he hasn't made thrown a completion yet, and he might have even thrown a couple interceptions, and you might say some really nasty things about the quarterback if he did that. But then you find out that, he's got a broken collarbone, and that went undiagnosed, and his dog just died. you know, and now you realize, oh, okay, oh, I was totally wrong about this guy. And now, so, you know, here you're watching them, and he keeps throwing these balls and missing, and your opinion of him keeps going down and down and down until you just think he's just so low. But then you find out, oh, I was wrong, and he comes right. That's that word is avenge our blood, give us our dignity back. And that's how I think that word is translated. And that would also make sense because I can't remember which church it was, but he promises the church that in the judgment, the people who are oppressing this church will find out who the Lord loves. Now, of course, the Lord loves everyone, but the oppressors will find out that these people that you're mistreating, the Lord cherishes, and you don't want to be mistreating somebody the Lord cherishes. In other words, these people will see just how valuable and just how wonderful and just how special you really are. Because a lot of times when we are mistreated or oppressed or whatever, that's a big part of our wound, is that we feel insignificant. We feel like we're not important. We feel like we're just dirt, and the fact that these martyrs are under the altar, I think, is also really interesting. It's such a weird place to be, but this idea of being up again, I think, is related to that. So that's how I'm leaning, but I'm open to all of that, and I'm still learning. So it's a great question, though.
Great question. And again, just this is why I love that we do this show, because it causes you to, first of all, engage deeper with the sermons, but then also you get to hear from people, and they ask things that maybe you have pondered yourself or not at all. And so now you're like, oh, that's a great question. Let me think about that. So thank you for sending that in. From it on a more practical level, I agree that there is freedom in trusting God to take care of injustice, but that is somewhat abstract. And you were very transparent to say this many times. You live,
Mhm.
as well as Gregory, in that world, but you recognize the need to come down to the more practical. So thank you for that. This person is wondering, do we not still, as Christians, have a duty to care for others, including fighting injustices? They bring up all the verses about caring for widows, orphans, etc. Shouldn't we still try to change unjust policies and laws, share food, resources with others, etc.?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting, like, there were multiple times where I specified that, of course we have to keep doing this. the
Yeah.
real liberty of and the joy of God's ultimate justice isn't necessarily that, oh, that's great, now I don't have to do any of this social justice stuff. The real joy and liberty there is that now my faith and my joy and my hope is not contingent on being successful, because there are so, I mean, um look at how depressing it is trying to make change in this world. It is so hard. And if we are to be a light to the world, it's really hard to be a light to the world if you're facing failure after failure after failure. And the lament of Dr. Martin Luther King, when he's just like, look, I can't remember exactly how it is, but something along the lines of, yeah, it's dark and there's failure, but the arc of history bends towards justice. In other words, it's going to be a long time, but you have to trust that it gets there. And in that, you can endure the all the short-term failures that you encounter. And so I think that is the real joy there, is that I don't have to hook all of these good things that God has on my success in this thing that it's really hard to succeed at, even to the extent that Jesus didn't succeed at it. So that should be an indicator that, if Jesus didn't solve, homelessness and all of these problems, we should have appropriate expectations for ourselves as well. But of course, you got to keep doing that in the same way that Jesus did. But you still live in light and joy, in the same joy that was set before Jesus. We have that as well. And so we do our work in joy, not in terror, not in dread, not in anything but this joy and good news that the arc of history does in fact bend toward justice, and it will get there. And whatever wrongs we have will be made right. And the glory that will be revealed in us is beyond compared to anything that we encounter here.
Yeah, that's good, Dan. I think the only thing I would add to that is I would say to this question, yeah, and you were very right. You talked about this, and you even talked about how in the overarching story of Revelation, how important it is that we treat one another well, that we care for one another. Like that is a huge part of the story. If you want to say that's main character energy there. And so, absolutely, we are to care for others and fight in a different way for others. But what came to mind for me when I was thinking about this question is because they brought up, say, orphans, and let's say a woman is orphaned because her husband dies and it's awful, and you come around and you support her and love on her and help care for her. That's beautiful, and that is God's love at work. But the reality is, we in ourselves cannot bring true justice to that situation, because true justice would be it not happening. And it's much like what you said about if someone were to harm your child. Like the true justice is something that we could never get. That's why people who are related to victims and stuff, they say, and it is someone was caught and they're convicted and blah, blah, people will say, do you feel like justice was served? And many times you'll hear people say, well, no, because justice would be me having my kid back, or me having my spouse back, or me having what. So we truly cannot bring true justice. And I feel like that's a part of where God just takes that burden off of us. But what we can do is do the things that we are called to do in loving and caring for one another and just in doing our parts. So again, that doesn't mean that we abdicate responsibility. Absolutely not. It doesn't mean that we don't speak out and speak up for things when we see it. It doesn't mean that we don't call things wrong that are wrong. I'm just saying the reality is true justice comes when God restores all things, and there's no need for any
That's
of
right.
that stuff. So.
Yep. Yeah, I
There
think
was
that's right.
a second part to that question. These are some good questions, guys. Okay, how do you proceed thinking bad people versus bad powers at work, especially in trying to remember or believe that all people have unsurpassable worth, which is something we talk about a lot. Like if we come across an evil situation and know the person responsible, and we believe that everyone has unsurpassable worth, how do we like deal with that? Do we blame and condemn the person for the evil thing, or we give them a free pass because it's just evil powers, or what is the third way?
Yeah.
Is what they are wondering.
That's a great question too. Man, you're right. These are good questions.
Oh.
I think that I think you have to do both. You have to know that the perpetrator of evil is a child of God, is loved by God at least, and there are principalities and powers at work, and we're all vulnerable to that, and so we have to be vigilant in our faith, and we have to guard our heart. And if we lose heart, we have to take heart. We have to get it back, and we have to guard that. And because we have to protect it against this super duper, this Satan figure who is seeking to steal, kill, and destroy. And he's seeking to kill, steal, and destroy in the world. And he might just try to do that through us. And so that's the tragedy, that someone who is precious in God's sight would get used in that way. It's horrifying and terrible. And God still loves that person, but they are going to be held accountable for that. And of course, God is merciful too, and he calls us to repent, and he calls us to confess. And there's this article that has just stuck with me for so long that I read in the 1990s, and it was in Sports Illustrated. And Sports Illustrated devoted this whole issue to sexual abuse in minor league baseball, in kids baseball. I can't remember the name of the baseball level, but it was like 10-year-olds, and there were all these coaches in the country who had been arrested for fondling and sexually abusing these boys. And this whole issue was devoted to finding out what's going on there. And they would interview these coaches who were arrested and found guilty and serving time in prison. And what's really fascinating about that, and it's just really stuck with me all these years, is that in each of the people that were interviewed, none of them said, like, well, yeah, I would do it again. Darn right, I'm guilty, and it was great. It's just what I wanted, and it was everything I thought it would be. And I mean, nobody said that. They all said unanimously, "I'm glad I was caught." In other words, even though they were driven to do it, and so part of them wanted to do it, there was another part that really didn't want to be doing the things that they were doing. And there was this relief that they were not the vessels of this evil anymore. And they were relieved that they were caught. And that's always stuck with me, because I think that even when we sin at that level, there is still this light of God in us, and we know that that's terrible, and at least I hope that that's the case. But in either case, and Greg's going to talk about this more going forward, we will be held accountable. Even if we confess and whatever, we still have consequences for our behaviors, and we can quit smoking and confess our addiction and repent of that addiction and still get lung cancer, because that's just one of the consequences. And so too, if a person is abusing children, I will hear their confession, and I will I will assume their repentance is sincere, but I'm also not going to let them close to my kids. I mean, that's just a consequence of their behavior, and so that's how I would say. And I don't know if that answers it, but
Yeah.
I hope it's in the ballpark of an answer.
I think it is great. And I think that every parent knows this, hopefully, that you love your kids unconditionally. And if your kids mess up, it doesn't mean, oh, you get a timeout from my love. No, like you still love them, and then you still hold them accountable. And I think to answer the question bluntly, do people just get a pass because they have unsurpassable worth? Absolutely not. People do not get a pass. Now, does it mean that I'm going to be the one to make them pay? That's not necessarily my call, but I can recognize that that is someone that God loves. while at the same time recognizing they are living in ways that are detrimental to not only others, but themselves. Doesn't mean that God doesn't love them, but it also doesn't mean that God condones or will just let it go, you know? So yeah, great questions.
Yeah, it was.
Dan, they worked us out today. I didn't even get to ask you because is there anything that you left out that you feel like you can share that doesn't give away too much, or do you think let's just hold on until next week? Okay, gotta hold on. Yeah, for those of you who are wanting more, good news, more is coming. So just hold on to next week. Again, Dan, thank you so much for sharing with us and for doing the work of going through the layers and knowing that you couldn't hit everything and saving some stuff for the next coming weeks. And that brings us to, you know what?
Yay! Woo!
Nugget time. It is time.
I'm doing a little side to side nugget dance. I don't know if you noticed that.
Yeah,
so,
you're getting into it. I like it. Dan, this has been you. So do you want to go first or do you want to end?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll just say that for me, as I've thought about this, and I've probably already started to do this in the past, but I do follow a lot of accounts on social media that are about different social justice issues. And one of the things that I've noticed is I just, when I worked in mental health, I worked with a lot of sociopaths, and I worked with a couple diagnosable narcissists. And one of the things that I noticed is part of how they negotiate relationships and negotiate communities is that they look for different vulnerabilities in people to exploit. And some of the big ones that they exploit is our sense of guilt, for instance, because we have these high personal moral standards, and they would exploit that to make people feel guilty and then give them what they want. Or fear is another kind of human kind of attribute where we're afraid of failure, we're afraid of not being good enough, and all of that kind of stuff, and afraid of just missing out on what God wants us to do. And we're also afraid of disapproval, and we're afraid of chaos. And those types of things are just like fodder for sociopaths and narcissists to exploit in relationships. And one of the things that I connected with some of the social justice accounts that I was following is I noticed that some of them have no joy. And there is just nonstop fear and guilt and playing into that. And then other accounts absolutely are, expose injustices, and they work very hard to expose injustices, but they do so with humility and still with joy, and they share good news. If the social justice accounts that you follow don't ever share success stories or good news, that's a red flag that they're trying to manipulate the audience. And so something that I did is I just started to notice the accounts that I was following, and the ones that were never joyful, that were never sharing good news, that were only showing the dark and never the light. I stopped following them. And I tell you what, I have felt so much better and hopeful since doing that. And so I don't know if maybe that's a way of being in denial, but I don't think so, because I still follow these other accounts, and I feel more like light in the world having done that than and I feel like I'm less swallowed up by the darkness. And we don't do any good in the world if we're swallowed into the darkness. We only do good if we can still shine as light. It's the same thing where you have to give yourself oxygen before helping others on the airplane. It's you have to maintain, you have to guard your heart. You have to take heart before you can serve others. If your heart has been taken, if your heart has been swallowed into the dark, you're no good to anybody. And so that's something that I've been doing that has been helpful, and that is my nugget.
I love it. That is so good. My nugget is it's centered on the verse from John 16 that you shared. In the world you will have trouble, but take heart. And I just loved how you said, like, this is an active thing. Take heart. And so my encouragement, my nugget is that yes, I think it is important whenever we experience any kind of injustice, anything that is not God's ideal for us that brings pain or harm or just any to whatever degree, it's important to lament and to sit in that and to be honest with that pain and allow the Lord to take it from you. But then don't stay there. Like, take heart and actively go about living your life in a way that reflects the character and compassion of Jesus. Take heart. Sometimes you've got to do that for yourself, for your situations. Many times you have to do it for others. And so I think you will hear us, you have heard us say, and you will hear us say, this is not a passive thing. This isn't just sitting back and just seeing what happens, No, this is actively saying, this is right, this is wrong, and shining light in darkness and standing up and defending others. The manner in which we do so matters. And so, yes, take heart, be active, and allow the Lord to guide you as you're doing whatever it is you need to do to ensure that light is shining and the darkness is not overcoming. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
I feel like it's something I'm still working out, but I feel like it could be helpful to someone. Take heart.
That's awesome. That's great.
All right, you guys.
Amen.
Well, Dan Kent, go take a nap, man. No, you probably have more work to do.
I do, yeah.
You deserve a break, but you don't get it yet. Thank you again for sharing with us. And hey, thank you guys for those are incredible questions and comments. Keep them coming. We really do appreciate it. We'll see you 4 p.m. On YouTube in the chat. And hey, if you do have questions, comments, send them in musecast@whchurch.org. We really do love to see what you guys are thinking and wondering about. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.